Our last question before we go to Senator Lieberman for closing remarks. As Brian is a sitting government official and on his way out, the point of privilege will go to Brian for the last question. Now, Brian, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we can't ignore that there is an election about to happen. And we have many friends on the other side of the aisle. You know, and I know many of our colleagues, and we call them personal friends. Let's assume somebody was from Vice President Biden's team who was sitting with you, Jake Sullivan. And Jake Sullivan, we were sitting here. What would be the message that you would say to Jake Sullivan as to your experience in dealing with Iran now? And should they be have the fortune of having an administration elected and President Trump not being reelected, what's the message you would want personally to say to Jake or somebody like Jake in the role and experience that you've had during your time there? So I don't want to put you in the spot, but what would you say?
Well, the first thing I'd say to Jake is that we're hopeful about a second term. The second thing that I would say to Jake is regardless of where you stand, at some point there is going to be future administrations. We hope that that's after 2024. It's very clear that you've got to get your Iran policy right if you want to make progress in the Middle East. And if you have the wrong policy, it leads to all sorts of violence in the region. I mentioned earlier, it would have been impossible to broker a peace agreement between UAE and Israel if they feel like you betrayed them with the wrong Iran strategy. It's not possible. There's just no trust there. So you really have to, I think, sort of my lessons from this period is that the biggest threat that our allies and partners in the region face is not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it's Iran. You've got to start there. And then after Iran, it's like the Muslim Brotherhood, it's extremism on both Sunni and Shia, it's jobs, right? It's all these sort of basic things. But on the security side, because Iran is the biggest driver of instability in the region today, you've got to get that right. And I think that's a universal, it should be a bipartisan issue. You talked about making this bipartisan. I was very pleased that the House of Representatives had almost 400 signatures. It was a letter to Secretary Pompeo saying we have to extend the arms embargo. That's the American spirit, right? You've got to stand up and counter Iran. The Iran deal, I get it that it was well-intentioned, but it failed. It failed to deter Iran, and it did not address the problem of Iran's nuclear program. So that's what we need to do. We have put in place enormous leverage for a second term to get the kind of outcomes that we're going to need. In this case, deal or no deal, our pressure and isolation and defending ourselves has been very successful. The president would like to get to a deal. Whether we have one or not, this policy that we have in place needs to continue. It just needs to run like a river. And if we get to a deal, fine, but if we don't, this is the kind of policy that makes the Middle East more peaceful and stable.